It's quite clear to anybody who has read a book, played a video game, or seen a movie or play in the past century that actions are a staple in nearly every narrative possessing medium. A character doing anything from stoically walking out of a room, to assaulting someone, to destroying a starship, somehow resonates with people in a way that they tend to just accept. The question is then posed as to why an audience finds action engaging to begin with. What effects action has on an audience, as well as how to implement it properly, can be better understood through a combination of both biological and literary understanding of how it affects a person's mind. Now, Aristotle believed that characters were secondary to the actual sequence of events that occurs. While he believed that actions should follow each other logically, he didn't see characters as essential to that order. Characters were not there to be characterized, they were there to take part in an event. In Aristotle's mind, the mythos was the purpose of the story, not the characters. This is not to say that characters in a narrative following Aristotle's model cannot be characterized, but they weren't intentionally written in such a way that they would. The problem with this theory is that no matter how much one believes a plot can occur without the will of the characters within it, the only entity acting within the story are the characters. As such, they are the agents causing events to occur. The mythos could not occur without them. A more modern model for narratives shows characters as the component that causes the plot to occur. Put simply,
a story is just a series of events. A plot is a reason why these events are occurring. A plot connects these events together, making them logical. B follows A and not C or D, and the story shows or tells us why. Plots come from characters. Characters behave a certain way because of their motives. Thus, essentially, plots are character motives. Classically, the two characters we should be most concerned with in a story are the protagonist and the antagonist. As their individual plots intersect, conflicts arise. A theme is what a story is about. All themes should require conflict. A good theme, like man versus himself, should change something about that character, like the protagonist's or antagonist's perspective. This is called character development.
what this basically means is that if characters didn't feel a certain way, they wouldn't act a certain way. If they didn't take certain actions, then the plot would not occur. As such, the characters and their actions are the audience's lens into the story. That being said, the question still exists: why does the audience care about the characters to begin with, much less the events that occur within a story? While academics seem to concur on how a narrative should be composed, it's still debated as to why one is engaging to begin with. A common assertion is that the audience identifies with the character and imagines themselves as the character. This, at first, seems like the correct answer until one considers contrary examples. Why is Hannibal an engaging character? How are HAL 9000, the Joker, or Sauron relatable? There are two academic schools of thought as to why we care about fictional characters. The first of which is called simulation theory. What it asserts is that on-screen or on-page situations elicit the same emotional response a real situation might, only they're running in what can be referred to as offline. The key difference being that our minds are aware that a movie, game, book, etc. isn't actually occurring. As such, the audience doesn't feel the need to call out or to help the characters on screen as one would if it were really happening. The emotion is still there, it's just not driving a response. Here's a quote from an article in the New York Times. A psychologist at York University in Canada performed an analysis of 86 fMRI studies and concluded that there was substantial overlap in the brain networks used to understand stories and the networks used to navigate interactions with other individuals. In particular, interactions in which they were trying to figure out the thoughts and feelings of other individuals. Biologically, this means that neurotransmitters are being released, but our mind knows that it does not have to act upon them. Further, in a study led by cognitive scientist Veronique Boulanger, the brains of participants were scanned as they read sentences like "John grasped the object" and "Pablo kicked the ball." The scans revealed activity in the motor cortex, which coordinates the body's movements. What's more, this activity was concentrated in one part of the motor cortex when the movement described arm-related, and in another part when the movement was concerned with the leg. This theory is fairly comprehensive and attempts to explain the mental dissonance an audience can experience, in which they derive enjoyment from watching humans and orcs battle, apes take over the world, or anything in the horror genre for that matter. Another school of thought is called thought theory. At its core, thought theory states that the mere thought of an event occurring is enough to warrant an emotional response in humans. An example used by thought theorists is a response an older sibling might have when a younger sibling tells her that he was hit on the playground. The older sibling is not witnessing the younger get hit, but the same anger can build up. This was developed in response to simulation theory and attempts to explain the same phenomenon without the complexity required by simulation theory. What thought theory fails to address in its simplification is the necessity for context in a narrative media. The thought of violence in general doesn't warrant a response so much as a belief would. If I believe that you are wrong, that's one thing, but the thought of your being wronged is another. The problem with thought theory can be rectified by examining the examples they use and identifying what they need to add. It's not the mere thought of violence that elicits a response. Violence, by nature, requires at least one member in the first party and at least one member in the second. Think of these parties as characters. When the character being dealt violence is one's brother, the attachment warrants the response of the older brother. The older brother does not necessarily identify with the younger brother any more than he does the attacker, but there is an attachment. It's important that the character being injured is related to the older brother, otherwise he might not have cared. But what if the injured party had started the fight? Then the audience might have cheered for the victor. This is why context, especially in a story, is important. Context is what allows us to believe a story. The question remains, however, as to why action in particular is so engaging. One possible explanation lies in a study designed to track how participants segmented events. They watched an actor perform 3 actions: folding laundry, assembling a video game console, and building blocks. Sensors were strapped to the actor's head and hand to track their distance, speed, and acceleration. Participants were then asked to segment his actions into as long as possible while still being a meaningful action, and as small as possible while still being meaningful. What the researchers discovered was that the amount of change in a given variables, speed, distance, and acceleration, correlated positively with the amount of participants who segmented a given motion, but only during the smallest meaningful action test. The greater change in variable X, Y, or Z, the more people saw it as a meaningful action. Researchers then replaced the actor with a digital simulation of 3 colored balls attached by lines, moving in a way that emulated the same types of motions. They got largely similar results. This shows that an action is still perceived as an action regardless of context. Whether or not an audience cares about an action is another matter. A person folding laundry is just a man folding laundry. A man folding laundry for his dying grandmother who raised him is not. Thus, action is both movement and motivation. From the evidence provided, one might say that action in particular has no more meaning than any other dramatic element. On the contrary, it indicates how much meaning actions have on both a literary and neurological level. An action, compared to a spoken line, is analogous to the larger movement, so to speak. There's a large difference between the same context leading to a character saying, "I think you're wrong," or that character killing someone. An action can show many things, including fury, desperation, acceptance, sorrow, determination, etc., and it can do it non-verbally. Used correctly, an action can sometimes be more effective than words in conveying a message. Even used incorrectly, i.e. with a weak plot, enough action can satisfy an audience with low expectations by being well presented enough. This doesn't suggest an absence of the elements previously discussed, it just suggests that the audience is expecting a lower degree of polish. This has far more to do with spectacle, but no matter how shallow the characters, an action is still a representation of their will. It still stimulates the brain in a way similar to the act of actually performing an action. It doesn't necessarily make it good writing, but it also doesn't deprive the action of value. An action is only as meaningful as the context of a work allows it to be, because context is what defines the character who is taking the action, as well as the people and environment the character is acting upon. Character actions are a physical representation of a character's motivation. Since motivation is the root of a plot, a character's action is a visual representation of how a character has affected a story. Actions, along with dialogue, stimulate the brain in ways similar to actually experiencing such things, albeit they stimulate it in a slightly different way. As such, context leading to a character's behavior should be clear. Action can be a useful tool for a writer, and its visceral effect on a narrative has made it the staple in media it is today. A more modern model for how narrative shows